Hi, I'm Liz Flint, and I'd like to give a quick shout out to my co-author, Jonathan Hoffman. We're with the Dibley Geology Center here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and this is our presentation on how to collect a fossil legally from public land. We recently went through this process ourselves, so we'll be using our experience as a case study to illustrate some of the points in this presentation. So our story began a few months ago when we learned of a fossilized whale on a local beach here in Santa Barbara County. So our first step in this process was to go out and check out the fossil to see if it was something that we wanted to collect. What we found was a middle Miocene mysticete encased in Monterey shale. It had an exceptionally well-preserved skull of about 5 feet long and a disarticulated skeleton. So we took a look at this fossil and thought, this is fantastic. Of course we want to collect it. So next our minds turned to whether or not we could actually collect this fossil. And as you can see in the photos here, we did have a couple of access issues because it was on a fairly remote beach. However, we determined, of course we can get this whale off the beach. What's the big deal? So the point here is that before you dive into any sort of permitting process, just take a moment to consider whether or not you actually want to collect the fossil and are able to do so. So once we decided that we wanted to collect the fossil, our minds turned to how can we do this legally? A quick note about my background. I came to paleontology later in life. I'm usually working on pygmy mammoth fossils that have been collected off the Northern Channel Islands. But before that, I studied political science. I worked mostly in politics in the United States Congress. I then went to law school and became an environmental and land use lawyer, where I represented clients who were trying to get permits. And then I moved down to New Zealand and Australia, where I worked for a city council planning department, where all we did all day, every day, was process planning permit applications. So I come to this topic from several different angles. So when you are confronted with or considering excavating a fossil from a new site, the first thing you should do is find out whether the site is privately or publicly owned. If it's privately owned, you're going to need a written contract with the landowner, and that's not really the focus of the presentation today, so I won't go into a lot of detail about that. The laws do vary by state, and I do recommend that you consult a lawyer to draft that contract before you even consider digging that fossil. What we are focusing on today is how to get permission from a government agency when your fossil site is on publicly owned land. In that case, you're going to need a permit. So what I'm presenting today is a universal permit process outline, meaning that pretty much any permitting issue that you're considering is going to go through this same process. It's not specific to how do you obtain a permit to excavate a fossil whale in Santa Barbara County or from a beach in Santa Barbara County. So this process is, first of all, you're going to determine which agency has jurisdiction. Then you're going to determine which rules apply. Then you will need to prepare and submit an application. And then your application will either be denied or approved with conditions. So, jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means who has the authority to grant permission to excavate the fossil. Generally, jurisdiction is going to follow from which government agency owns the land on which the fossil site occurs, but there also may be other government agencies that have been granted jurisdiction over the site. Jurisdiction can often be straightforward. For example, if your fossil site is on Bureau of Land Management land, then the BLM is going to have jurisdiction. However, the question can be a little bit more complicated, especially when you're dealing with the state or local level. So in that case, what you're going to want to do is contact your local planning department or planning authority. They should have a land use and zoning map or something similarly named. And a lot of these maps are now online. They are in the ArcGIS format. And if you have the address of your site, these are relatively simple to use. You just pop your address into the search box, it'll pull up your parcel of land, and that should tell you everything you need to know about that land in terms of what zones or overlays or other rules may apply. And if you have any questions about that, there should be a planner there who can help walk you through the process, and you also can do your own research by consulting the planning documents that are on the website. Sometimes, like in our case, figuring out who has jurisdiction when all you have is a GPS coordinate can be a little more complicated. And this situation could apply when, for example, you've been out on BLM land, maybe excavating a fossil, you decide to go prospecting, and maybe you've walked a couple of miles and you find something great that you want to collect. I recommend that you always take a GPS coordinate and go through the process that I'm describing here to make sure you know who has jurisdiction. It's very easy to wander off of BLM land, and also don't trust things like fence markings or fence posts, signposts. You don't know if those things have been accurately placed, so always take your GPS coordinate and go through this process. In our case, what you can see here in this satellite photo, it's an overview of what we were dealing with. You can see over to the right, there's a pin marked SBMNH. That's our location here at the museum, which is in the greater Santa Barbara area. And over on the left, you can see a pin marked fossil site. So our fossilized whale was about a 30-minute drive away from the museum. What you can note is that it's in what's a relatively rural area, meaning we didn't have a lot of addresses that we could refer to figure out who had jurisdiction over this site. So in this next photo or satellite image, we're getting a close-up look at our fossil site. And you can see a couple of things. We've got a pretty busy highway, the US 101, next to us. There's a small area that you can pull off the highway to park. And there's some railroad tracks that we had to cross, and then a bluff of land that we had to traverse to get down to the beach, where you can see that our whale was there somewhere on a sandy beach. So when we were trying to figure out who we would need to get permission from to excavate our fossil whale, I remembered something from my legal days called the mean high tide line rule. And this is a rule that is common anytime you're near a waterway or in a tidal area or on a shore. It applies in a lot of areas, not just California, but how it applies in California is that anything that is seaward of the mean high tide line is publicly owned by the state of California, and anything that is landward is either privately owned or could also be owned by another government agency. So what's irritating about the mean high tide line is that it's not a fixed boundary. It actually moves according to what happens with the tides. So when I put our GPS coordinate into our local land use and zoning map, you can see that line there near the coordinate is a fictional representation of the mean high tide line. So I've got two things here that are not fixed. The GPS coordinate, which may not be exactly precise, and also a boundary that's moving. So this made me very uncomfortable in terms of trying to decide who actually had jurisdiction over our site. And just a point to emphasize here, if you ever find yourself with a situation where you're that close to a boundary line, take the time to make sure you understand which side of that boundary line you are actually on. I do know of one situation in particular where someone was pursuing a wastewater permit. The jurisdictional line actually went down the middle of the street. They had the wrong side of the line and they wasted 6 months talking to the wrong agency. So make sure this doesn't happen to you. Okay, so going back to our situation. So on this next slide here, Jonathan and I went out to the fossil site about an hour after high tide. Jonathan is pointing to our fossil whale, and you can see that this proves definitively that we are definitely seaward of the mean high tide line. So this meant that the state of California owned our fossil site. And 2 points that are important here. One is that you should always, don't just rely on what you see on the computer, always go out and do a site visit in person and ground truth your information. And also take a lot of photos, because then we were to document what you have found, because we were able to show this photo to the agencies to prove that we were actually in the tidal zone and solve the issue of jurisdiction. Okay. Once you know who has jurisdiction over your site, then the rules that apply will follow. Again, this might be pretty straightforward. If you're dealing with BLM land, then the Federal Paleontological Resource Preservation Act is going to apply. but also in other situations, again, when you're dealing with state or local agencies, the rules that apply might be a little bit more complicated, like our situation. So here is the regulatory burden that we faced. And this is a deliberately ugly slide to reflect how we felt about it. First of all, because the site was owned by the state of California, there was a somewhat obscure agency called the State Lands Commission, and they had jurisdiction over our fossil. And then we were also in the California Coastal Zone, which meant that the California Coastal Commission needed to issue a coastal development permit under the California Coastal Act. Also, because we were in the coastal zone, the County of Santa Barbara had jurisdiction. And then finally, all of the above would require environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA. Once you know what rules apply to your site, that's going to determine the permitting process that you will go through. And just a couple of quick words about fossil excavation does not fit naturally within the typical permitting process. Most permit applicants usually want to build something or exploit a natural resource, and so accordingly, the process can be very complicated, time-consuming, and expensive. In contrast, paleontology is unique. Paleontologists are providing free assistance with natural resource protection for the government agencies. And also, there's a very good chance that the agency staffer that you are working with has never processed a paleontology or fossil excavation permit before. So that's going to affect your process. Also, there might be erosion or poaching risks that also add a sense of urgency to your application. So this is going to sound like some government doublespeak, because it is. You are most likely going to require a permit to excavate your fossil, but you are also very likely to be exempt from that permit requirement, which is clear as mud. Or in our case, this is a photo of the muddy sand that we had to dig through to get through our fossil. Okay, so we were fortunate in that we had exemptions from the Coastal Development Permit, something that is creatively titled a written exemption. And also we were able to get a letter of non-objection that instead of having to go through the State Land Commission lease process. So in the second case of government doublespeak in this presentation, even though you might be eligible for an exemption, you still have to go through the application process, whether you need a permit or whether you qualify for an exemption. Okay, so let's talk about applications. Of course, the specific application that you will be filling out will depend upon the agency that you're dealing with. However, it's safe to say that all of these examples are going to ask you to answer the same questions, which you can think of as the who, what, where, when, why rubric. So in this case, who is you as the permit applicant. And also, it's good to not only include who you are, but also a description of your mission statement. Again, you want to emphasize that you are either a nonprofit or an educational institution. The what is that you are going to be excavating a fossil. And I'm going to guess that if you're watching this video, you know how to excavate a fossil. But again, remembering that the agency staffer has likely never excavated a fossil and doesn't understand that process. So you're going to need to be very descriptive in all the steps that you need to take to excavate the fossil. Where is going to be a description of your fossil site. Include a lot of maps and photos and anything else that is going to give the agency staffer a good idea of what your site looks like. When is going to affect the term of your permit or your exemption. So you need to specify what time frame you're looking at. And the why, I think you want to provide an explanation about the scientific importance of the fossil that you are excavating. And a quick word here about accession. What I've been talking about in this presentation is how to get permission to excavate the fossil. This is a separate consideration from what actually happens to the fossil after it has been excavated. In other words, who has the right to keep the fossil once it's out of the ground. Some agencies will want to work out the accession of the fossil before they are going to grant you permission to excavate. And for other agencies, it won't be as much of a big deal. So just make sure that you understand the accession issue and address it at the appropriate time in the permit process. And another quick digression is access. So just because you get permission from one public agency to excavate a fossil, you might need to cross private property or maybe another public agency's land in order to get to your fossil site. So just make sure that you have legal permission to do that as well. So again, going back to our fossil site, we were able to park on this pullout area from the freeway. And then we did actually have to walk across private property to access the beach. However, this was very clearly a public trail that was used every day by folks to get down to the beach. And what we were doing wasn't so different from anyone else who was just going down to the beach to enjoy it. So we didn't get special access to cross that land. Okay, so you've submitted your application and you want to expedite the process so that you can get your permit or your exemption as quickly as possible. So the way to do this is just make sure that you are very descriptive in your application. Remember that you are educating the decision makers about fossil excavation. And also make sure that you put together a thorough application that addresses all of their criteria. If you don't, they're required to address all of the criteria. It's up to you to describe how your application meets those criteria. And if you forget one or don't address it, they're just going to kick the application back to you, which will delay the process. One option too is to use political influence. What I recommend is that you check with the higher up at your institutions, see if they happen to know anybody who works at the agency that you're dealing with. And even if you don't have any connections, then you can also just contact your local representative and ask them to inquire about your application. Again, make sure if you're dealing with a state agency, then go to your state legislator. And they can't officially, they don't have the authority to expedite your application, but if they do, if a legislator makes an inquiry about an application, it tends to make that application magically float to the top of the pile. In our case, we did have a contact at the State Coastal Commission. We were put in touch with appropriate staff and we were able to get our exemption within a week, which is nothing short of a miracle. And then at the State Lands Commission, we didn't have a contact, so we went through the standard process of applying through the website, and that took an additional 2 months to get those approvals, which again is relatively fast, but it was a very long 2 months while we were waiting for that. And the photo on the left is what the fossil looked like when we applied to the State Land Commission, I'm sorry, to the State Coastal Commission. In other words, no sand on the fossil. And then 2 months later, when we actually started to excavate, which is the photo on the right, you can see we had about 4 or 5 feet of sand that had since washed onto our specimen. And this was sand that we had to dig out every single day. Okay, so after you've gone through this lengthy process, at the end of it, you're going to get the decision from the agency, which looks as follows. Just some examples. A couple of things to follow up on once you have your decision. If you're denied, you can file an appeal or possibly resubmit an application and address whatever issues you didn't, that made your application not be successful. But assuming that you do get a positive decision, your decision is going to have conditions on it. And so just make sure that you understand those conditions and comply with them. If there is a substantial change in your excavation from what you applied for, make sure you apply for an amendment from the public agency. And also just be mindful of the term of your permit or your exemption and make sure you apply for an extension before it expires. Otherwise, you can go back to, have to go back to the beginning of the process. And just keep the paperwork on you as you dig in case you encounter law enforcement. So in closing, we all know the paperwork part is super annoying, but hopefully this video will help you get through it quickly and you will soon be out digging your fossil up. Thank you.